All right, guys, so we are out here at the range with Steve from Alpine Arms, and we're going to talk about grip. So that's a big fundamental of becoming a good shooter is your grip.
It's huge, man, especially with a pistol. Like rifles and stuff like that, we can get away with being a little bit lazy, but our pistols, if we're not properly gripping it, we're ultimately not going to have those rounds count, right? Yeah. So we're going to be missing or not hitting where we're intending.
Well, let's Steve's going to demonstrate first, and then I'm going to follow up, and he's going to make some corrections where needed.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. So the biggest thing with grip, right, is we want to be able to understand how this thing works mechanically, right? The slide reciprocates to and from the back or front and rear, right? So we want to be able to identify this and basically make it to where the pistol, understanding the pistol is going to move, but we don't want it to move and return in a different position, right? So we need that consistency and stuff like that in our grip to be able to manage recoil and eventually have targets or shots on target, right? So if I go ahead and draw this pistol, go ahead, give me my 3-point check. So chamber, breech face, magazine well. I'm gonna go ahead and depress the trigger so the hammer's forward, right? So right now I've got a safe pistol. What I want to do, or what I typically do when we're working with new shooters, understanding if we have a manual safety versus a striker fired pistol that has internal safeties, but nothing else that we have to manually manipulate in order to, nothing that has a manual safety that we need to manually manipulate in order to get it to fire, right? So this configuration of a 1911 or 2011, like this thing could be carried with a round in the chamber and stuff like that, but I need to do a couple of things in order to get this thing to fire, right? So grip is part of that. So I depress the safety. Once again, give myself a little check just to verify that this thing is safe and unloaded. But what I want to do is I want to make sure that my firing hand has positive control of the firearm. Support hand is going to cover as much of this thing as I possibly can on the frame, understanding that I want that consistency, right? So when you guys get these things, you know, make sure that the gun is safe and unloaded, do your 3-point safety check, and when you're at the house, this is where that dry fire in practice kind of really comes into play, right? So I grip the gun in the same manner every single time. What I want to do is I want to have the front side of my fingers kind of on par with the grip, right, itself. I've got my trigger finger on the outside of the frame, understanding those 4 firearm safety rules. Treat every gun as though they're loaded. Don't point your muzzle at anything you don't intend to shoot. If I'm on target, I can be on trigger and know what's in between you, the target, and backstop, right? We want to set ourselves up for success right off the bat. So I've got this here, understanding that this gun does have a manual safety. My thumb is actually going to ride on the top of that to help with this recoil, right? Because if this thing was in a vacuum, the gun would go up and it would twist depending on the rifling, right? So we're trying to correct that or go opposite of that, right? So thumb's on top of that. I've got my regular grip here. Left hand comes up. I'm kind of locking out and using my thumb to orient myself towards the target. So that left hand kind of comes in and presents itself. And right here, I have both my dot, I've got my front sight, I've got everything downrange and on target as I wanted it. So a solid grip, understanding that if I press the trigger, the gun would go off, it would recoil. And what I want it to do is ultimately return to the same position, but I don't want it to go beyond that, right? So this consistency and locking this gun in, we're trying to manage that recoil to come up and lock down in that same position. So it's a very, it sounds simple, but it's hard to do, right? We have to put that practice in. Pistol shooting is one of those things that it's definitely a perishable skill, right? So we have to take time to understand this, and the grip is going to be the consistency in where people typically start to miss.
All right, so I'm back here. Thank you, Steve, for explaining that real quick. So I'm going to pull out my pistol. We're gonna make sure we're safe and clear. And I'm gonna do my proper grip, or what I assume to be a proper grip. And then I'm gonna have you, we're gonna show some improper grips and kind of show how to adjust from there.
Sounds good.
All right, so I'm gonna step pointing down range. I'm gonna draw my pistol.
Face down range, do your 3-point check. Do your, chamber, breech face, magazine well. You can go ahead and let that slide go forward if you want to. From here, go ahead and grip it how you typically would. All right, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to get as high up on this beaver tail as possible, understanding that center line, right? So we know that this gun is gonna move up and come back down, so how do we kind of work together with this thing, right? So John's grip is looking pretty solid right here. He's got, right now you guys can't see it, but we'll show you here in a little bit the other side. He's got his 2 thumbs resting on top of each other. Basically, it's driving that muzzle towards the target right now. So, we don't need to, we don't have issues touching our pointer finger to the tip of our nose, right? So it's kind of the same thought process when it comes to target acquisition and getting this gun up and on target as quickly as possible and efficiently as possible. So his front sight post is going to be slightly blurry, rear sight's going to be slightly blurry, but that target should be nice and focused. Once again, this is where it kind of comes into having our thumbs and fingers aligned in the direction of the target. That kind of helps everything out. From here, I'm going to have him take his trigger finger. He's going to touch the trigger face. He's going to go to where what we say is the wall, which is where he's going to start to feel positive resistance. And at that time, I'm just going to have him fire or press the trigger to the rear. So physically he can feel it. He's going to leave the trigger to press to the rear. I'm going to come behind him, going to rack him, kind of simulating this gun going through the cycles of operation. At this point in time, he's going to release his finger off the trigger. He's going to hear that audible click and he's going to feel it. All right. So this, now his gun is mechanically ready to fire again if he wanted to. But this is just one of those things where the consistency and understanding how this thing feels, how this thing sounds, is going to eventually allow you to be more efficient with your platform. Go ahead, I know this can kind of be taxing at first, so go ahead and reholster, buddy. When we're reholstering our gear, one thing, if you guys are on the range and stuff like that, it's not necessarily a bad thing to go ahead and check, verify that you don't have any additional clothing and stuff like that, especially like in Colorado. If we've got winter conditions and stuff like that, you've got a bunch of layers like what we kind of talked about earlier in the previous video. But verify that you don't have any additional clothing. Last thing we want to do is shorten our range day by putting an extra hole in us that we didn't come to the range with.
I do want to mention something, especially when reholstering. It's not a race.
No.
You see a lot of people going real fast. It's not a race to the holster.
100%.
That's the last thing you want the gun to be in a fight. So make sure that you're being fluid and checking everything.
100%, yeah. So be safe, right? So like that's kind of the #1 priority when we're at the range, you know. But think about what you're doing. Take a look at it. Like, you know, there's a lot of cool people out there that'll say, oh, well, you shouldn't have to look at your holster. Well, if I'm still having to observe a lot of stuff in a defensive situation, I probably don't need to put my gun away anyways. I probably need to top it off if I have any ammo available, right? So use common sense, guys.
All right, and then let's show an improper grip. Yeah. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and give command.
All right, go to ready.
This is hard.
So this is a super common grip, especially with relatively new shooters, right? So the problem with this is you see this gap in between here, so that will allow this pistol to travel a lot more if he presses that trigger and fires around downrange. So you have no consistency in this thing, right? So this gun would come up, it would come back down, and it would recoil really hard. Not harder than it does regular, it's harder to manage that recoil. All right, so what we'd want him to do is slide this right hand up as high as he can on the back strap, raising that center of gravity for his hand in order to manage this recoil and stuff like that. So John's doing a really good example of it, but he's got a tactile indicator right? So his trigger finger in low altered or failing light is essentially in the same spot every single time, right? So the grip is something that is going to be consistent. That is part of the grip, right? So, you know, he's safe. If he were to trip and fall or something like that, he's not going to accidentally fire a round that he doesn't want to, right? Because if his sights and the gun is not on the target, we don't know where that round is going, right? So it's that safety and considerations.
Now, Steve, let's show another common grip that
Yep.
we see a lot with new shooters.
Yes.
This one.
So the problem with this one is we've got our thumb on the back side of the slide. What happens when this thing, he presses that trigger, the gun fires, all right, this slide reciprocates to the rear. Ultimately, that thing comes back at a lot of G-forces, and that will fillet your finger, right? So once again, we don't want to cut our range day short because now we have to go to the hospital and get stitched up.
Now, here's another old school one that I've seen in the past, is the teacup.
Yep.
Now,
Yeah.
what's wrong with the teacup?
Really, you're not getting much support out of you're not getting additional grip out of that support hand. So it's just kind of sitting there resting or holding your other arm up. It's not really doing a whole heck of a lot, right? So I might as well just be shooting one-handed.
Well, I want to thank Steve for talking about grip. It is a big fundamental part of shooting, and without a good grip, all the other things do not fall in line. You can have a good stance and not a good grip and still have bad.
Yeah, you're kind of wasting your time and your money. Ultimately, you're building up those neural pathways to do things incorrectly, right? So it's harder to unlearn it.
Cool. Well, thank you, Steve, again for helping us with
appreciate it,
this.
buddy.
And we're going to step on and do some drills and show a little bit of holster drawing.